everyone. Welcome. Thank you all for joining us at the second of our free lunchtime talks on how we can make our gardens greener. I'm Frankie Taylor, the Engagement Officer at the Gardens Trust, and I'll be chairing today's session with Ken Thompson on native plants for native wildlife. And I'll introduce Ken in a moment. But for those of you who didn't join us last week, or perhaps don't know us, let me introduce ourselves. So hello and welcome. We are the Gardens Trust. We're the only UK national charity dedicated to protecting and conserving historic parks and gardens. This series of lunchtime talks is free to attend thanks to funding from Historic England, but we offer a wide range of online events for a small fee during the autumn and the spring. And the funds that these raise help to support our work. So do visit the events page on our website to come to more events like this if you're interested. And if you're a member of the Gardens Trust already, you can get 25% off of those paid talks. So go to our website to find out more about that, and I'll add a link into the chat shortly where you can find out more. But let me introduce our speaker today. We're joined by Dr. Ken Thompson, a plant ecologist and author of books such as Common or Garden, Encounters with Britain's 50 Most Successful Wild Plants, and the popular Where Do Camels Belong? The Story and Science of Invasive Species. In 2016, Ken was awarded the Royal Horticultural Society's prestigious Veitch Medal for his contribution to the advancement and improvement of the science and practice of horticulture. So we're really pleased and honoured to have you join us today, Ken, and I will hand over to you.
Thank you. So that's today's question. Do we need to grow native plants for native wildlife? And the thing about this question is, for some people, this is kind of obvious, or at least almost too obvious to need investigating. I mean, why wouldn't we want to grow native plants for native wildlife? I'm not going to tell you really today whether you should or not. I'm just going to raise a few things for you to think about on this subject. And I should also say that in a short talk like this, on a very large subject, we're not going to do a lot more than scrape the surface, really. One could spend a lot longer talking about this. But my first point that I want to make is that this native plant business is not quite as simple as it appears at first sight. For example, let me show you this nice picture here, which is a kind of collage of most, not all, but most of Britain's arable weeds, some of which will be familiar to you. They're still very common. Some of which are now extremely rare. But the interesting question to ask about all these arable weeds in this picture is, how many of them are actually native plants? And the answer is, in fact, none of them. None of them are. They are all human introductions. And the reason they're all human introductions is really very simple. It is that when Britain was recolonized after the end of the last ice age, essentially the whole country was covered with trees for quite a long time. And there really wasn't anywhere for arable weeds to live until people started farming, and all these plants got introduced from Europe. So these are all human introductions. Here's another rather iffy plant for you to think about: Fritillaria meleagris, the snake's head fritillary, a plant that we often grow in our gardens, but is also found in the wild. And it's a bit of a conservation icon, really. And lots of people spend quite a lot of time and effort and money conserving this species, or at least trying to conserve its habitat. and it's actually on the red list of vulnerable species in Britain. So you'd imagine, wouldn't you, that it would be a British native, but it's not. It is in fact a garden escape, and in fact quite a recent garden escape. Unlike the arable weeds that we looked at a minute ago, which at least have the merit of having been here a long time, snake's head fritillary is a recent arrival, and if that thing that's important is of no conservation significance at all. Here's something else to think about. There's a hillside here covered with possibly the most intensely disliked alien invasive plant in the whole country, which is Rhododendron ponticum. But this raises the whole question of what is native. And the reason it raises the question is Britain has been repeatedly glaciated over the last few million years. And every time the ice melted, we were colonized by a set of European species which were never quite the same in each interglacial, each warm period. We always acquired a slightly different selection of the European plants that might have colonized us. And Rhododendron ponticum, if you go back to the previous interglacial, the warm period before the present one, the one that we currently live in, was a British native. It was here without any human introduction at all. And it's just bad luck that it didn't make it in this interglacial, and therefore is an alien. So does that make it any less alien or any less undesirable? I don't know. But it was here long before we were, put it that way. The complications don't stop there. What about, so much for plants, what about our fauna? It's not always clear what's native there either, to be perfectly honest. Let's just take an example here of moths. And I pick on moths because they're an extremely diverse group. We have about 2,500 species of moths in the UK. They're mostly, we miss them. We don't see them because they're mostly around at night. But we keep acquiring more. So between 1900 and 2019, 140 new moth species have become thoroughly established in Great Britain. The great majority of those new species are from Europe, and as far as we know, colonized Britain quite naturally, on their own, without any human influence. So technically, that kind of makes them native. And of those European species that have colonized Britain recently, most eat native plants as well. So they're well and truly natives. The criterion for being an alien, of course, is being introduced by man. So these are not species that were introduced by it for the most part. And this is a rate of introduction of new moths that is actually accelerating. And it's happening with something like moths, of course, because they can fly, so they can get across the channel. For things that can't fly, it's more difficult. And so we have a kind of philosophical conundrum in Britain about what's native and what's alien, and whether things should be introduced or not. Because we have this sea barrier between us and the rest of Europe, not a problem that other countries in Europe have, because they're all connected, of course. So things just move around across borders without any human assistance. So what about alien plants and native biodiversity? Now, what is the actual relationship between these two things? Well, this is quite a difficult thing to study without doing a proper experiment. So fortunately, the RHS done this for us. A few years ago, they carried out this really nice Plants for Bugs project at Wisley. Here it is when it's just been set up. And it's lots of plots full of plants of different origins. And essentially, there are three kinds of plants in these plots. Some plots are full of natives. Some plots are full of plants which we describe as near natives. That is, they're not native, but they're closely related to native plants. Some plots are full of plants we call exotics, which are very, very much unrelated to our natives. So, and the plants are designed to be kind of similar in same kinds of plants. So here, for example, if the native is Eupatorium canabinum, hemp agrimony, the near native is a North American Eupatorium purpureum. Exotic is Verbena bonariensis from South America. Native is box. The near native is Sarcococca, Christmas box, which is a close relative of box. And the exotic is Pittosporum. You get the idea. And here's the plots after they've been growing for a few years. The plots were thoroughly monitored for pollinators, for insects and invertebrates that run around on the ground surface and that live on plants. It was all done very thoroughly for 3 years. At the end of it, lots of scientific papers were written, none of which I recommend you read. But here in a nutshell is what the experiment discovered. Across the whole study, natives supported more wildlife than near natives, and they in turn were better than exotic. So if you're in favour of growing natives, it's all good news. But it's quite a big but. The effect of plant origin was not large. In other words, the difference between the three kinds of plants was not large. And that difference was dwarfed by the effect of quantity of stuff. More plants, more biomass, more flowers, irrespective of where those plants came from, more wildlife. To quite a large extent, the different plant types were also complementary. They were doing different things. So the exotics, for example, tended to provide fewer resources for pollinators in summer, but more late summer flowers than natives. The exotics also were more likely to be evergreen and provided more shelter in the winter. So they tended to have less invertebrates living among them in the summer, but more in the winter. And finally, detritivores, and these are the enormous number of animals that eat dead plants, don't care at all about plant origin. Fairly obviously, they don't care where a plant came from before it died. And this is a massive number of animals in most ecosystems, including gardens, and all the things which eat them, of course, therefore don't care about plant origin. So the conclusion of the RHS experiment at the end really was that plant origin is not all that important for wildlife in gardens, and that your best bet is probably to grow a mixture of all these different kinds of plants. And in fact, that's what most gardeners do without really thinking about it. What about wildlife in real gardens? So let me take you to the birthplace of wildlife gardening in Britain, 66 Scraptoff Lane, Leicester, the home of Jennifer Owen, the patron saint of wildlife gardening, who for the last 30 years of the 20th century spent every other waking moment catching, counting, identifying anything that moved in her very ordinary suburban garden. She wrote a book about her results after 15 years. And then after the full 30-year study ended, she wrote another book that recounted the whole 30-year story. What she discovered was that there was an unbelievable amount of wildlife in her really very ordinary garden. But that's a different story. Here she is, receiving her Veitch Medal from the RHS a few years ago now, from Sue Biggs, the boss at the time, and Lady Elizabeth Banks, the president at the time. Now, Jennifer Owen, as well as catching and counting everything she possibly could in her garden, she made a particular study of moths. And in particular, what she studied was what the moths were eating. And she did that because moths, as I've already said, are an extremely diverse group of insects, huge numbers of species, eating a lot of plants. And they're very, very important in ecosystems because the larvae of moths eat plants just about always. And so they're very important herbivores in the garden. And both those larvae, the caterpillars, and the adult moths are hugely important as a source of food for other animals, other predators in the garden. Things like spiders, birds, parasitoid wasps, so on. So they're very important. Jennifer Owen made a particular study of the moths in her garden, and in particular of what their larvae were eating. And here are some edited highlights of what she found. Of all the native plants in her garden, she found moths were eating 27%, just over a quarter of them. But they were eating 35%, just over a third of the alien plants in her garden. If you looked at the most widely used plants in her garden, each eaten by 5 or more species of moths, 6 of those were native, but 9 were alien. And the most widely used species, eaten by 19 species of moths, was Buddleia, which is, of course, from China. And this was a complete surprise because most of those examples of moths eating Buddleia were completely new. No one had any idea that these particular moths ate Buddleia at all until Jennifer Owen showed that they did. So not a lot of evidence really there that you should grow natives or aliens. You should just grow. You should grow both. In fact, grow whatever you like to grow, to be honest, and something will turn up and eat it. Now, it would be interesting at this point to conclude by sort of mentioning a few places where you can see lots of wildlife in gardens. But frankly, if Jennifer Owen's garden teaches us anything, it's that gardens, almost all gardens, are good for wildlife, frankly. And all a garden needs to do to have lots of wildlife is to have lots, as the RHS experiment showed, as lots of other research shows, to have lots of vegetation, lots of trees, lots of shrubs, lots of big plants, lots of flowers. You have all those things, you will have lots of wildlife. So, for example, I've picked 1 or 2 of my favourite gardens here, completely at random. So this is Gunby Hall in Lincolnshire, which is, the plants here are arranged very formally, but that doesn't matter. The animals don't care. But there's lots of them, lots of plants, lots of trees, lots of flowers. The Garden House in Devon, which some of you will know of, near the Cornish border, very famous garden. A much less formal arrangement, but again, lots of plants, lots of trees, lots of shrubs, lots of flowers, lots of wildlife. And an example which I've thrown in because, well, 2 reasons I've thrown this in. One is that I actually visited it the other day for the first time, passing. And because this is a garden that was voted Britain's favourite garden open to the public just 2 or 3 years ago, and I can see why. It's very nice. And again, lots of plants, lots of vegetation, lots of trees, lots of shrubs, lots of water. And I mean, there's no formal study of the wildlife in this garden, but I suspect it's extremely rich. There was certainly a lot of wildlife flying around the day I was there. So, if you want a recipe for the perfect wildlife garden, lots of plants. That's it, basically. So, there you are. Thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you very much, Ken. That was absolutely fascinating. I've learned lots. Just at the beginning of when you were speaking, it was really interesting to see just how many plants are non-native and how many are invasive or have been introduced by humans at some point in the past. And also that fact about over the last century, we've seen 140 new moth species that have appeared in this country. It's absolutely fascinating stuff. We've got a few questions here from people, but I had one as well because I was thinking about that RHS study and how it showed that there was a kind of big increase in kind of wildlife numbers, and it kind of focused on the amount of stuff in a garden. But I wonder what your thoughts were on biodiversity and whether you think it's maybe just as important to have lots of a few key species, or should we be really prioritizing biodiversity over numbers? What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, you're talking about plants, really, whether we should all be kind of homing in on the few sort of killer species that will, you know, really bring in the wildlife. And it's well, it's a difficult question, isn't it? It's very tempting. It's very tempting to grow plants that you know are very, very popular with pollinators in your garden. Okay, I mean, I can't resist growing lots of catmint in my garden, for example, because bumblebees just fall over themselves for, it's humming with bumblebees from dawn till dusk the whole time. But on the other hand, if I grew even more catmint, and if everyone grew even more catmint, that would leave less room for other things. And one of the things that research on wildlife, not just in gardens, but in all habitats, teaches us that variety is absolutely crucial. So, for example, much as bumblebees clearly love my catmint, people who've looked at what bumblebees actually do leaving the nest and returning again to the nest, they may visit a dozen or 15 or even 20 different species of flowers on a single trip. Now, we don't really know why they're doing that. What are they looking for? Why are they wasting that? Why are they not just going to, the plant they like the best and staying there? Obviously, that's not enough. Obviously, they and one possible reason for this is that pollen. One of the things they're collecting, of course, is pollen to raise the young. Pollen is always different amino acids, different proteins, and different other secondary chemicals. And it may be that they're just, that the perfect mixed diet is exactly what they're mixing by visiting all these different flowers. And so what you want to do, what I'm saying, I'm going on a bit here, but what I'm saying is in the end, give the insects and the other invertebrates in your garden the maximum possible choice of what to visit, what to eat, and so on. I
I
think.
love that. Yeah, I love that idea of giving wildlife their kind of 5 a day of different types of
Exactly.
things.
Yeah.
I'll just get to a few other questions that we've got here in comments. Vicky said that diversity is power. If only we all remembered that, not just in gardening, but our life too. Jill asks, what do you think about the current fashion for rewilding? It's a huge question.
Yeah. Yeah. The trouble with rewilding is you get 10 different people in a room, you'll have at least 11 different ideas of what rewilding means. Okay, so all I would say is that in the wider landscape, that's one question. In gardens, it's almost a non-question, in that your typical garden is almost as far from wild as it's possible to get. Your typical garden is intensely managed, controlled, directed by the gardener who owns it. And what we know from Jennifer Owen's mammoth study in Leicester is that it's that management creating that small scale diversity of everything next door to each other: lawn, flower bed, rockery, pond, fruit bushes, shrubs, trees, all within a few feet of each other. We think it's that huge diversity that really makes gardens so good for wildlife. And if you turn your back on a garden for almost no time, really, a few years, all that contrived diversity goes away. Everything becomes much more uniform. You basically have a woodland quite soon. If I leave my garden alone for 5 years, I'm halfway to a wood. Your garden will be the same. So rewilding's, it's not really an option. It's not really a gardening question.
Interesting. I think it's a very good answer. We've only got a couple more minutes, so I've got one question. We've only got time for one more, sorry. And that is, how do we adapt the native species in our gardens with climate change, especially if we want to grow more native species?
Yeah, that's a really good question. That's a really good question, because increasingly, if you just want to grow lots of natives, that's not really an option, because as the climate changes, they are not the plants best suited to the current climate. So, for example, Kew have recently carried out a review of the trees they grow in at Kew, with an eye on what's going to survive in another century. Because if you're planting trees, you have to think about what's going to survive in a century, because they're still going to be there. And what they've concluded is there's really no point planting most common trees, birches, oaks, whatever, alders, limes, because in 100 years' time, none of them are going to survive. So, in a sense, you're kind of compelled to look around for things that are going to do well in future climates. And gardeners kind of do this all the time, almost without thinking about it. You kind of slowly adapt what you grow. Things that do well, you grow more of. Things that you plan to keep dying, you give up trying. And many of those are natives, sadly.
Interesting. Yeah. So we just have to think even more longer term,
We
perhaps, in our
do.
garden than we currently do. That's so
Yeah.
fascinating. Thank you very much, Ken. That was really, really interesting. I'm sorry we couldn't get around to all of your questions. We've just got to really quickly kind of wrap up now. But I just want to thank Ken again very much for your presentation and for joining us all today. It's been really interesting. I'm going to go away and read lots and read all of your books now. Thank you everyone for coming, and join me in saying thank you very much, Ken. And we'll see you all hopefully soon. Thank you, everyone.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.